the last leg, the fourth session of the conference, the study day today. And at this point in time, we're going to be covering the theme of From Derrynane to Dublin, Daniel O'Connell, Memory, and the Irish Cultural Landscape. And our first speaker of this session is going to be Victoria McCarthy, talking on the subject of the lure of Derrynane, the designed landscape of Daniel O'Connell. Victoria.
Unlike Daniel, I wasn't here last night checking this out. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Great, okay. Okay. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much to the Georgian Society for welcoming me here today and for your very gracious hospitality. I'm very, very grateful. So I have timed my talk. The last run was about 22 minutes, so I'm going to, if you just bear with me, I'll try and get through it as quickly as I can. So this paper will explore how Derrynane's designed landscape was intertwined with the personality of its most famous occupant, Daniel O'Connell. Now you must excuse me, I'm probably going to call him Dan during this talk rather than O'Connell. I feel rather fond of him. It will demonstrate that in a remote part of Kerry, Derrynane House and the lure of its designed landscape was an atmospheric stage from which Dan sought to project himself as a statesman of European consequence and a place where his vision can be seen. The talk will conclude with a reflection on Dan's legacy, a cultural landscape at Derrynane of international significance. So for those of you who mightn't be very familiar with Derrynane, here it is in all its glory. It's located at the southwest of County Kerry in the barony of ephemera, near the village of Cahersiveen on the Ring of Kerry. The slide illustrates the character and setting of the broader landscape of Daniel's home. We can see Derrynane Bay, Derrynane Abbey, here at the bottom on the right-hand side, where Mary is buried. The aquamarine water and the white sandy beaches, the climate and conditions that sustain subtropical planting, evidenced here by the Tasmanian tree ferns that now flourish in Derrynane Gardens. I must also add, we don't always have this weather in Kerry. So these maps, and I do love a good map, these maps from 1832 and 1841 show us Derrynane in Daniel's time. Although two-dimensional, they tell a multi-dimensional story of space. We see his gardens, where he walked, rested, sat, and reflected. To the west were carved walks between the trees, banks, and shrubs, using natural variations in the contours and exposed rock. To the north, the geometric patterns of the walled garden are clearly visible. The sea forms the southern boundary of the site. Now, the next few slides show the component elements of the designed landscape. So against a mountainous backdrop of rock and purple heathers, Derrynane's green oasis of woodland brought the culture of improvement into sharp relief. And I must thank the Office of Public Works for their very kind permission for me to use some of the nicer photographs you'll see in this talk. On this slide, we see Derrynane House, the architectural set piece, which was Daniel's Kerry home until his death in 1847. Now cared for by the Office of Public Works, the house and the gardens are open to the public since the 1960s. Here we see some of the detail of Daniel's domain, which demonstrates the lush landscape of the gardens, as well as the geology of the host environment. The map here in the top right, a detail from the 1842 Ordnance Survey map, shows the variety and extent of movement throughout the site in Daniel's time. The hierarchy of different approach routes highlighted in red, with the extent of permeability throughout the site highlighted in red hatching. Now, to present some context, the following slides develop O'Connell's connection to Derrynane. In the 17th century, the O'Connells were hereditary constables of the McCarthy Moors. For those of you who mightn't be familiar with Kerry's history, essentially the northern part of the county was under the Anglo-Norman control of the Earls of Desmond, while the southern part remained resolutely Irish. The O'Connells occupied Ballycarbery Castle, a strategic stronghold which guarded a valuable, secure harbour for shipping and access to Atlantic trade. Seen here in Alexander's Nimmo's map of the area on the left, and the ruins of Ballycarbery just outside Cahersiveen town here on the right. After the Cromwellian Wars, the O'Connells forfeited Ballycarbery, but they retained lands in South Kerry, settling at Derrynane, which they leased from the Earl of Cork. As Catholics, the O'Connell family were subject to the rigours of penal laws from 1695. A marriage settlement from 1724 identified a John Connell of Derrynane as one of the signatories. At Derrynane, they enjoyed a lavish lifestyle where family, social prestige, hospitality, and Irish culture were nurtured in the tradition of the Gaelic big house. Now, the human endeavour that created this beautiful landscape by the early O'Connell family cannot be ignored. A 17th century survey of the Ephemera barony speaks of a very desolate and bleak landscape, a place of limited agricultural or mercantile opportunities with no fairs or markets, and significantly a place ravaged by war where only burnt or ruined houses or castles dotted the landscape. The 1659 census shows and records a limited scattering of people throughout the barony, and interestingly, of those, only 2% were English. In the 18th century, the area was still isolated, with poor road access to other centres of power and security throughout the county. Its remoteness prompted local landlords to fear Ephemera would become the asylum of the outlaws and vagabonds. Its peripherality remained challenging even in the 19th century, when the German prince Hermann Puckler Muskau made his way over the mountains, and describing his approach to Derrynane here on the right-hand side. In the 1750s, Charles Smith, the noted apothecary and surveyor, noted that Donal Moore, Daniel O'Connell's grandfather, who clearly took time out of his busy schedule with 22 children, had built a very good house and made other improvements, the only plantation hereabouts. So does this mean that Derrynane was the only improved and planted house in Ephemera? I don't know. And in terms of the 18th century house, seen here on the left, and thank you to Professor Brick for its use, accounts in 1773 show the purchase of 60 sash squares from the Plumber's Arms in Cork. Whether or not these sash squares were eventually used does not appear further in archival sources, but it does show intention of improvement. On the death of Donal Moore, his son Maurice O'Connell, commonly known by the sobriquet Hunting Cap, inherited Derrynane in 1770, and he grew the family fortunes by astute business dealings, smuggling, and land acquisition. In terms of the gardens at Derrynane, Hunting Cap's account of goods in 1788 confirmed he purchased apple and fir trees for Derrynane. Eileen Dove ní Chonaill, Daniel's aunt, wrote of her memories of golden apples which grew at Derrynane Moor in her lament, Cuina Artilera, following the death of her husband in the 1770s. 2 generations later, another lady, Ellen, the Liberator's daughter, described Derrynane's gardens as antique with a fine old orchard. And in 1858, she recalled her granduncle Maurice walking with her father in the courtyard to take a walk in the beautiful old garden laid out in terraced grass walks. In 1802, Daniel secretly married the dowryless Mary O'Connell, a daughter of a Tralee doctor. A few years later, in 1807, Daniel promised her that he was in full business, really getting a load of money, and at this rate, Mary would soon have not only carriages, but a country house. What an intriguing statement for a man of the people. No Irish farmhouse for Dan. In contrast, Mary thought a move to Derrynane would be injurious to her health and concluded, and this kind of sounds as though you'd hear it today as well, that the disadvantage to his girls, the society of a country town in Ireland is not the most advantageous for young girls educated as they have been. They would rather live in the greatest obscurity anywhere than live in any of the country parts of Ireland. So when Hunting Cap died, eventually, in 1825, his will here seen on the slide, Daniel inherited Derrynane, despite him marrying the dowryless Mary, and undertook a programme of change to the house and gardens. And now we kick off. So Daniel held strong views on many things, including architecture and landscape, which may explain why he carried out the renovations to the house and gardens himself. In Dublin, we know, for example, that he criticised the new church of St. Andrew in Westland Row, wishing the architect Pugin had been employed, as he would have given them something better for their £23,000 than the ugly, massive building we've got. Of landscape, he thought Castle Blaney in County Monaghan was the only thing he had seen that deserved to be looked at while travelling in the area. It commands a view which a person who saw Killarney might admire. Don't know what they think about that. Of the scenery in Killarney, his letters to Mary described it as enchanting. But at Derrynane, he turned his attention to the house and a suite of buildings, as well as the gardens and the wider domain. He built a large two-storey extension to the south of the 18th century house, and he raised its height. Oblique sea views from the extension and its setting were often admired by visitors. Dan employed a tower house as his architectural set piece, a structure well known in the Irish landscape. It was here where he met and accommodated his visitors, and we know he had many of those. These were his public spaces. The chaotic arrangement of long, narrow corridors, dark rooms, the rambling plan form, stairs within rooms, changes in internal level, and architectural deficiencies of the earlier 18th century house were not on show. An architect, John Burke, known for his work as designer of Roman Catholic churches and convents, was subsequently employed in 1845 to suggest amendments. Mr. Burke concluded that the hall was not only confined but dark, and Daniel's castellated tower was very heavy, and the entrance doors quite unsuited to a respected building. Burke proposed external improvements to, and I quote, give the building the character which it would be desirable it should have, worthy of the place and worthy of the proprietor. Here we have that image-conscious Dan yet again. Kennels and summer house were also constructed. More about these shortly. So in terms of the gardens, Dan may not have been entirely green-fingered. Excerpts from his letters shown here describe the secondary importance of the gardens, and his limited knowledge was evidenced by William O'Neill Daunt, who recounted how Dan had laughed when discussing sick ash trees, believing of all the preposterous schemes I've ever heard, the notion of cutting a tree down to make it grow up seems the most comical. Now, despite Daniel's hurries to undertake work to the house to get his family in after Hunting Cap died, Derrynane's lease was only renewed in early 1826 by the Earl of Cork. The new lease spurred Dan on to direct his local agent, John Primrose, to realign ditches, cultivate coarse grounds, and drain marshy lands. Dan wanted an immense amount of tillage, and he complained that his labourers at Derrynane, and I love this, seemed to be employed in digging out sand when it was sure to be filled in the ensuing day. And he instructed John Primrose to go to Derrynane and to take special care that John O'Connell, not a relative, is not running him to foolish expense by half-finished vagaries. And I found a lovely slip of paper in the archives shown here with a letter from John O'Connell. It's undated, but it highlights the practical challenges in terms of coastal location, problems getting labour, and the issues with the landscaping, as well as money. that faced John in trying to comply with Dan's instructions from Dublin. Okay, everybody, so my apologies. I'm going to have to try and project my voice. Can you all hear me? Yes. If you can't, if I start getting a little quiet, put up your hand and I'll project, okay? And I hope that time comes off my 20 minutes. Anyway, so Daniel was, can be suggested, concerned by the first impressions of visitors to his Kerry domain. He wrote to Primrose in December 1826, concluding, "I'm anxious about the entrance road, and if you can job it cheaply, it would be well to do so." As part of its design, large kennels were built immediately to the north of the road, in a prominent location approved by Daniel. When Dan went to Kerry, he had a pack of beagles and loved running all over the mountains near his home, chasing after hares. And it's wonderful to think of all the visitors coming from all parts of Europe, I suppose, really, who had to go hare hunting if they wanted to hang out with Dan. So anyway, so Dan's kennels got pride of place. Daniel later wrote to Mary in March 1832, announcing his plan to extend her usual drive, to extend and create a circuit of her own. It demonstrates Dan's efforts to use a circuitous routeway and carriage drives to elevate and aestheticize the experience of the site. An approach road curved gently towards the house, preventing visual connection between the public road and the private space around the house itself. Daniel built a summer house, a two-storey structure with a conical roof and circular in plan. It was carefully sited on a high point in the landscape to the west of the house, from where it commanded unimpeded sea views. From here, Daniel could survey his estate, but not that of tenanted lands or views of the estate of his ancestors, but rather an outward focus towards the Atlantic Ocean. Here he got rest and solitude and silence and reflection. Again, that man of the two sides, perhaps. In terms of social significance of the site, Derrynane represented one of Kerry's most important Catholic big houses, a very different type of place to the other important Kerry Catholic house owned by Lord Kenmare in Killarney. Here at Derrynane, hospitality was an integral part of the cultural traditions sustained by the role and persona of Dan as Gaelic patriarch. His hospitality at Derrynane was shown to visitors of all creeds and nationalities, and this comes through in the sources over and over again, whether they are Catholic or Protestant, Irish or foreign, repealer or anti-repealer. And one writer left an account of sitting down to dinner at a table set for 33 people, Irish, English, Scottish, French, German, and an American. Visitors commented on their visits to Derrynane and sketched images of the house and grounds, which are excellent really to go through when you're doing some research. Daniel also used Derrynane as a legal and political stage to project himself in the role of statesman, politician and barrister. The German prince, Pückler Muskau, who visited Derrynane, found, and I quote, O'Connell on the terrace of his castle, like a chieftain surrounded by his vassals and by groups of the neighbouring peasantry who came to receive his instructions or to whom he laid down the law. Nobody would dare to appeal his decisions. O'Connell and the Pope are here equally infallible. Lawsuits, therefore, do not exist within this empire, and this extends not only over his own tenantry, but I believe over the whole neighbourhood. An interesting use of language. The political significance of Derrynane House is also demonstrated by its use in political pamphlets, like this 1844 image from the National Repeal Association, where Derrynane House was part of a suite of images chosen to depict Ireland. There are 8 representations on this image, which included Queen Victoria, Glendalough, Achill Island, an Irish harp, the Giant's Causeway, an ancient Irish royal family, an ancient battle helmet, and Derrynane. Here, the house was the physical embodiment of an emerging national identity, employed to respond to an awakening power of place to influence a new political reality. Well, that's my claim, anyway. In terms of the social and cultural use of the domain, O'Connell's reputation as liberator of Catholics and his efforts to embed religious freedom and tolerance within a liberal political state is well documented. Indeed, he wrote of the Act of Union that the religion of the inhabitants was no longer to be a badge of persecution. Dan's construction of the chapel in 1844, along with the papal permissions for various religious services, strengthened his connection with the Catholic hierarchy. After his death in 1858, Reverend Kirby linked Daniel's Catholic and political persona to the chapel building, describing it, and I quote, as the same chapel where he so often knelt and which he so often nourished with the bread of angels, his Catholic zeal which enabled him to emancipate his countrymen. Strong words indeed. And interestingly, the protection of the chapel formed a significant part of later attempts to conserve Derrynane in the 1940s. I wonder, would Derrynane even be here without the intervention of the church when its demolition was being considered by the state in the 1960s. Dan also used Derrynane's antiquities to link the designed landscape with Gaelic culture. He used defined visual and physical connections between the house and Alter Hill to the southeast and Abbey Island to the southwest, the burial place of his ancestors and wife. He also incorporated a souterrain within a recreational circuit of pathways to the west. This demonstrates a deep connection to Irish cultural and antiquities. Following Dan's death in 1847, the house remained in the family. In 1933, Mrs. Eileen Hurtley and her sister Miss O'Connell inherited Derrynane on the death of their aunt. In 1945, inquiries were made to see if the Irish state would be interested in acquiring the property. And this is where things get exciting. Eventually, by 1946, matters were now urgent, and Derrynane was advertised for sale in the Kerry newspaper. The paper highlighted lack of state action in the matter, and that saving the house now fell to the people of Ireland. How times have been repeated. The inaugural meeting of the Save Derrynane Committee was held in May 1947, set up to try and conserve and protect Derrynane. The committee fundraised over 2 decades and carried out stabilisation works to the house. Notwithstanding exceptional efforts, fundraising locally, nationally and internationally, just like Dan, by the early 1950s, the Trust was in serious financial difficulties, and they made repeated requests to the state for assistance. And it's incredible to go through the boxes of Taoiseach files in the National Archives and see the letters coming in and the attempts to over and over and over again looking for help to conserve and keep Derrynane. The OPW architect, William McCurk, inspected the property in 1963 and concluded the house and chapel have no architectural interest and the immediate setting is without any distinction. His inspection noted the ruinous condition of the western and northern range of buildings and I quote, in the absence of architectural interest, the matter must be judged solely on the value of the associations the building has with Daniel O'Connell. Based on his report, the Minister of Finance advised the Taoiseach an elaborate scheme of restoration could not be justified and part of the house should be demolished. And the image on the bottom right, shows demolition work underway. These plans show the ground floor of the house surveyed in 1945 on the left-hand side, and the image on the right highlights the extent of demolition carried out by the state It is easy now, perhaps, to view this decision, this demolition of the 18th century house, as an act of vandalism, but scarcity of state finance, then as is now, cannot be ignored. Just over 5 decades later, as we sit here today in the glorious surroundings of the City Assembly House, how lucky are we now that considerations to demolish the house in its entirety, or decisions to use its ground for forestry or for the Congested District Board were not pursued. I ask that you might ponder what might have been. Daniel's legacy and his careful staging of its identity has survived. So in conclusion, while Dan may be known for his political views, his tolerance, his efforts to better our country, perhaps we should also remember him for his love of place and landscape, his appreciation for genius loci, or the essence of place. I leave you with this quotation and an image of Tralee, not Cahersiveen, or Derrynane, and I quote from Dan: "The view of Tralee Bay, with the declining sun making the sea quite a flood of gold, and the majestic mountains in various masses skirting the opposite side with vapours, assuming the consistency of white clouds covering a portion of the hills here and there, but leaving the base and summit in every spot plainly visible. It was a scene for a painter and made me half poetic and entirely patriotic. I do love the beauteous land of my birth." Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so our next presentation is going to be from Dr. Niamh McGowan Coleman, who will be presenting on the politics of stone and style, the O'Connell Memorial Church in Cahersiveen. Niamh is Associate Professor in the Department of History in the University of Limerick. She's also asked that we flag and draw your attention to a further conference that's going to be held in relation to the 250th anniversary of Daniel O'Connell's birth. This is going to be the annual conference of the Catholic Historical Society of Ireland, which will consider O'Connell and his legacy, and the conference will be held on Saturday the 22nd of November in DCU's St. Patrick's campus in Drumcondra.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to present this paper via recording. So, on July 25th, 1882, the Freeman's Journal newspaper published a letter from Canon Timothy Brosnan of Cahersiveen. "Dear Sir, now that the unveiling of the O'Connell statue is at hand, perhaps it would not be inopportune if the friends and admirers of the great Tribune considered whether this memorial, however comprehensive and magnificent in its totality, totally realizes the country's ideal of the immortal emancipator. As an old and ardent admirer of O'Connell, I for one beg to say that I think it does not, and I know that many others think so too, who are of the opinion that a distinctive memorial in the form of a church, a grand O'Connell Memorial Church, ought to be raised to his name. Now, sir, it so happened that just a year ago the thought struck me the most appropriate place for such a church would be his native parish." Canon Timothy Brosnan was well aware that the realization of such a project would require support from far and wide, and he wrote that the undertaking is so vast that in much better times and in far less critical a juncture I should shrink from beneath it unless being well assured of commensurate assurance. This was the beginning of a long and no doubt stressful fundraising and building project that resulted in the Daniel O'Connell Memorial Church of the Holy Cross that now stands in the town of Cahersiveen. You will note that I've used the spelling Cahersiveen throughout this talk to reflect the most common usage of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It is more commonly spelled with an S today, and in the early 19th century, Cahersiveen with an E towards the beginning. I won't dwell too long on the fundraising campaign here, as this has been the subject of a detailed lecture available online by Professor Maurice Brick. Many of the letters of support from various members of the Catholic hierarchy across the world are reproduced in an illustrated booklet from 1895, including one from Cardinal John Henry Newman. Donors included William Russell Grace, the first Catholic mayor of New York City, and several of the notes reproduced in the booklet include personal memories of the donors meeting O'Connell in person. The building required a long and ambitious funding programme, with priests travelling to America to seek support, and eventually the first Mass was held in 1902. This early photograph from the National Library of Ireland shows a temporary altar in place before the originally designed scheme was completed. As with many ambitious church building projects, it was imperative to bring the building up to a standard where it could be safely used by parishioners, and further works and decoration then could take place later on when further funds could be collected. A newspaper report on the first Mass held in the church in December 1902 noted that a costly marble altar had been ordered by Canon Humphrey O'Riordan, relying on the generosity of this people and the public, and later photographs show that he certainly was not disappointed. The Daniel O'Connell Memorial Church of the Holy Cross was designed by George Carpenter Ashman and built and designed between 1882 and 1909. And in this presentation, I want to focus in on two themes. Firstly, I want to look at the significance of key materials used throughout the building, and secondly, I want to consider the formal language of the building as an example of the expressionist use of archaeology in late 19th century Catholic architecture. So I'll begin by thinking about some of the materials used in the construction of the church. This beautiful 1884 drawing of the projected interior of the church is by Thomas Aloysius Coleman. And even though it is a monochrome drawing, it gives us a sense of a richly coloured interior with painted altarpieces and stations of the cross, a glossy tiled floor and stained glass. Great attention has been paid to drawing the stone columns with their floreate capitals, the moulding profile of the arches and the voussoirs of the ribs, and I'll return to some of these details later on. Coleman's drawing of the interior was reproduced in an earlier promotional booklet from 1886 for the O'Connell Memorial Church project, probably printed in order to aid the extensive national and international fundraising the project required. The booklet included a further perspectival drawing of the church exterior, with its soaring tower and spire, sadly never built, set against the picturesque West Kerry coastline. Both copies of this booklet, held in the Irish Architectural Archive, have the words "Red Sandstone from the Minard Quarry near Dingle" crossed out, with County Dublin granite handwritten in the margin. In the end, stone for the church came from Newry. The stone for the nave columns came from the Castlewellan quarries in County Down, and the Lancia slate and Irish oak were used in the roof. This emphasis on the use of native materials is a feature across many reports on church building projects from this period, giving priests an opportunity to emphasise that these buildings contributed to local economies and supported Irish industries and Irish workers. At a time of economic strain for many, priests needed to counter accusations that such grand building projects were extractive and self-aggrandizing. While most of the stone was from the island of Ireland, two significant stones came from Rome. The foundation stone for this new church was laid by the Archbishop of Cashel, Thomas Croke, on the 1st of August 1888. The reports from the Irish Examiner give us a wonderful picture of the anticipation leading up to this event. The hillsides on the route from Killorglin and through Glenbeigh were illuminated with bonfires as the Archbishop arrived, and the roads of Glenbeigh were decorated with ivy-draped arches and flags, and the town of Cahersiveen was illuminated with Chinese lanterns, which is a lovely image to imagine. The fact that the foundation stone came from the catacombs in Rome is often mentioned as a point of interest about this church, reflecting the personal support given by the Pope for this church, which would commemorate a layman. In fact, two stones came from Rome for the project. According to the Belfast newsletter on the 9th of February 1884, the Reverend Canon Brosnan today forwarded to Ireland by sea the first stone presented by the Pope for a dedicatory chapel to be erected at Cahersiveen. According to this report, the stone had been taken from the remains of the house of St. Clement, the first Pope and martyr. The second stone was a marble slab from the catacombs of St. Donatilla for the high altar and chapel, with an inscription affirming His Holiness's approval of the building of the church. The catacomb mentioned was actually St. Domitilla's catacomb, which is one of the largest in Rome. And in the church, both stones have actually been combined into one installation. And you can just see on this plan of the building the location of the foundation stones in the tower. The significance of these stones arriving in Kerry from early Christian Rome can be considered in several ways. So firstly, objects, relics and stones from Rome were often part of new Catholic church building projects across the world. The papers of Tobias Kirby, rector of the Irish College in Rome, are full of references to relics being sent from Rome to Ireland for altars across the country. Many altarpieces, paintings and sculptures in Irish church buildings were either purchased from Rome or were produced by Roman artists and sculptors. So these material connections between churches in Ireland and the Eternal City were an important part of 19th century Catholic spaces. The donation of foundation stones by the Pope to politically significant building projects was a feature of this period. And as Patricia Likos-Ricci has pointed out, Pope Pius IX had sent a slab of marble from the ruins of the Temple of Concord to Rome, engraved from Rome to America. And the anti-Catholic nativist party in the US, in Washington, who resisted Catholic immigration, seized the stone in 1845, smashed it and threw it into the Potomac River. So both the donation of this stone and its destruction reflect the fact that these stones were understood to have deep political and religious significance. Secondly, the story of the catacombs would have been very familiar to Irish congregations. The catacombs had been excavated sporadically since the 16th century, but there was renewed attention on them throughout the 19th century. In part, this was sparked by the discovery of what was thought to be the tomb of St. Philomena in 1802, whose blood was celebrated as a miraculous relic, and who became an important saint in the Catholic revival throughout Europe in the middle of the 19th century. The catacombs became an important element in asserting the authority of the Pope and the antiquity of the doctrines of the Catholic Church itself. These were issues of profound concern to the Vatican and to the Catholic hierarchy of the time in the face of the challenges of theological modernism or attempts to reinterpret key aspects of Catholic doctrine with references to changing ideas in the modern world. And those who could not visit Rome themselves could engage with the mystery and appeal and the authenticity and authority that they conveyed, of the catacombs through novels on the martyrs written by figures like Cardinal Wiseman and John Henry Newman, or through guidebooks to the catacombs. Of more immediate significance to an Irish audience, however, than the marble slab from the catacomb of St. Domitilla was the fact that the foundation stone was from San Clemente, as this was a building with an important Irish connection. The Basilica of San Clemente had been the home of the Irish Dominicans in Rome since 1677, and in 1857, Father Joseph Maluli OP, who was a Longford-born priest, began excavating underneath the basilica and uncovered the 4th century building which lay beneath it, now one of the most famous sites in Rome and possibly somewhere that many people have visited. This was an enormously exciting discovery and was much reported in the Irish newspapers. Father Maluli published books on the paintings and mosaics of San Clemente, and he was depicted in an oil painting by Richard Ewing, recording the final visit of Pope Pius IX at the completion of the excavations. The significance of the connection between Cahersiveen and San Clemente is expressed in this poem by Eugene Davis. Now, it's not a great poem, and the Dictionary of Irish Biography entry for Davis does note that he was, and I quote, able to write appealing verse in a matter of minutes to commemorate occasions, so this may account for poetic quality. But nonetheless, it is an interesting source for the contemporary significance of this material and symbolic connection with San Clemente. So, tis Leo's gift, this old foundation stone, the sacred element of martyr's faith that gleamed so long upon the archway of St. Clement, and connecting it to St. Peter and St. Paul and early Christian Rome. So these material connections to the catacombs and to the martyrs of early Christian Rome were seen as particularly appropriate for a church dedicated to Daniel O'Connell, the figure associated with liberating Irish Catholics from persecution and discrimination. By the end of the 19th century and throughout the first decades of the 20th century, stone became an important symbolic element, expressive element in architecture. The use of stones from specific regions of the world in building projects was used to express the global reach of the Catholic Church or to signify special relationships. In 1873, the parishioners of Watertown in Wisconsin thanked Cashel Town Council for the gift of a cornerstone from the Rock of Cashel to be used in their new church. And at the Chapel of St. Patrick and the Saints of Ireland at Westminster Catholic Cathedral in London, a range of marbles from Ireland are used in the decorative scheme, including red marble from Cork and green Connemara marble. And at the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., the global reach of Catholicism was expressed through the building materials, which included Algerian and Mexican onyx, granite from South Dakota, Norway, and Ireland, and marbles from Switzerland, Italy, Greece, Vermont, France, Northern Africa, South America, and Connemara. As well as underscoring a particular connection to the history of the martyrs, the foundation stones sent from Rome to Kerry for the O'Connell Memorial Church, therefore, are part of this tradition of expressing transnational connections and a global Catholic identity through the material of stone. And as such, this building, the O'Connell Memorial Church, is an example of the move towards a kind of archaeological expressionism and symbolic use of stone that followed the ecclesiological Gothic revival style of church building inspired by Pugin. So I want to move on now to consider the significance of the style of the building. So by the late 19th century, before the new O'Connell Memorial Church project had been mooted, the parish church of Cahersiveen was in very poor repair, and a photograph of the old chapel was included in the O'Connell Memorial Church booklet to give people a good sense of why a new church building was needed as a parish church as much as a tribute to Daniel O'Connell. Now, when it had been first erected, it was described by Samuel Lewis as a handsome building in 1837, and on the first Ordnance Survey map, which was surveyed in 1842 and engraved in 1847, the church is depicted as a substantial cruciform building connected to the Presentation Convent. In better days, it may have looked something like the interior of this chapel in Athy, with its plasterwork ceiling and pointed windows with deep embrasures. So as well as building a monument to O'Connell, it was clear that the church and the town of Cahersiveen needed a new church building for its Catholic population. George Coppinger Ashton was an established leading church architect by the time Canon Brosnan commissioned his church design, and recent commissions had included the Queenstown or Cove Cathedral. Now, Ashton's own description of the new church of Cahersiveen are quite revealing in terms of his key design intentions. He described the style of the building as Gothic of an early Celtic type, with a distinctively Irish character given to the church by the numerous deeply recessed lancet windows, the circular turrets, of which there are 5, besides the 4 angle turrets of the tower, the pointed battlements, and the stepped gables of the roof. The durability of the church was also stressed. It was to have a stone ceiling constructed in stone and concrete, and the Irish Examiner in 1888 reported Ashton's words that there are several examples of this mode of construction in our old buildings, but this is the first new church in Ireland since the Reformation with a stone groined ceiling. The reasons for adopting this challenging and expensive mode of construction included the remote position of the new church, which meant that it had to be as enduring and storm-proof as possible. Secondly, according to Ashland, there is nothing which imparts so monumental a character as a stone groined ceiling, requiring massive walls and buttresses to support it. The intended character of the building was further described by the architect, and he said that the details throughout would be very simple and severe, substantial dignity being the effect aimed at. So these descriptions are very illuminating in terms of understanding the intended impact of the O'Connell Memorial Church and in allowing us to see it as part of both of Ashland's own career as a designer and within the broader development of Catholic architecture in this period. And we can just maybe compare that to the much lighter and more open treatment of Cove Cathedral, for example. If we look at drawings for the building, we can see that the main design features on both the interior and the exterior emphasize the solid massing of the walls, with the weight of the ribbed vaults being carried down through the massive pillars of the nave. The final design of the capitals, which are plain rather than carved, may have been due to financial constraints, but they emphasize their solidity and capacity to carry this heavy roofing system. And similarly, the thickness of the walls on the interior is emphasized through the use of molding profiles. And hopefully you can just see these, my laser pointer here, just the molding profiles of the walls, of the arches here, for instance, emphasizing the thickness and solidity of the wall, the strength of that wall being able to support that heavy stone roof from the springing of the rib vault right down through the piers. And on the exterior as well, we can see that this idea of strength is reinforced by the rough-faced treatment of the stone, the solidity of the base, which buttresses the whole building, and the use of crenellations. And when we compare the Cahersiveen church to the much lighter and more open treatment of Cove Cathedral, we can see how the Church of Cahersiveen is more inspired by medieval castle architecture as much as medieval ecclesiastical buildings. So this emphasis on solidity and strength was seen as a key point of difference between buildings like the new O'Connell Church and the buildings that they replaced. A letter from the writer Aubrey de Vere about a new church planned at Rathkeale in County Limerick gives us a good insight into the way that this change was perceived at the time. De Vere sent his letter in 1856 to the Freeman's Journal in support of James Joseph McCarthy's new design for the church at Rathkeale in County Limerick, and it sums up much of this changed attitude. He praised McCarthy's noble design for the Catholic Church at Rathkeale for being eminently pure and dignified in character, not frittered away in elaborate details. The proportions of Rathkeale's new church, the soaring tower, the clerestory, the sheltering roof, the tall and slender windows, were for De Vere features of Ireland's ancient architecture, and he wrote that too many, even of our better modern churches, miss the monumental character that belonged to those early times from the want of sufficient thickness in the walls. What De Vere described as elaborate details may have been a reference to the experimental and eclectic approach to Catholic church design evident in the first 3 decades of the 19th century. During this period, when the Irish Catholic Church was really rebuilding its infrastructure in the wake of the Catholic Relief Acts and then Emancipation, we see lots of styles being used, from the elegant classicism of the Pro-Cathedral in Dublin to the Gothic exuberance of the Church of St. Canice in Kilkenny. Catholic chapels from the first half of the century tended to apply decoration to relatively simple architectural forms and to provide accommodation for parishioners via galleries, as at Youghal. And the solidity and the sculptural management of the thickness of the walls that we see in churches built in the second half of the century represent a decisive step change in that approach. And I think that the O'Connell Church provides a really beautiful example of that. Ashland's description of Gothic of an early Celtic type is also very interesting, and it reflects the beginning of a much greater engagement across Catholic, Irish Catholic building projects of this period with specifically Irish elements of Catholic history, whether through the stories of early Irish Christian saints, sacred sites, or even the 17th century Irish martyrs. Now, by the early 20th century, architects like John Joseph Robinson at Lusk and Rudolph Maximilian Butler at Newport in County Mayo were engaging much more explicitly with Hiberno-Romanesque forms in their new Catholic church buildings. Ashland's design for Cahersiveen, however, provides us with a really interesting example of ecclesiastical Gothic being shaped and adapted to express specific forms of Irish national identity just prior to the Celtic revival, in order to create an appropriate design for a church dedicated to an Irish national hero, Daniel O'Connell. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm more than happy to take any questions via email, as I'm not able to be here with you today. Thank you.
Taking the limelight at the end of the day is Derrynane, who's going to be talking to us on the topic of O'Mara's Irish House, Pints and Patriotism on Wood Quay. Derrynane is the author of The Dublin Pub, A Social and Cultural History, and is the historian in residence in 14 Henrietta Street.
Great. Okay, I'm very conscious that in that fine tradition of Irish people, we've run over time considerably. By about half an hour, so I won't keep you too long. This is the title of my talk, speaking on the former life of the intersection of Wood Quay and Wine Tavern Street when one is employed by Dublin City Council. It may seem something of a great irony, but the capacity in which I'm here today, I think more significantly, is the author of a new cultural history of Dublin pubs, in which O'Mara's Irish House appears. I counted amongst the great lost public houses of the capital in a pantheon that includes decaying remains like Barney Kiernan's, which there's still time to save, Conway's, but more often transformed built landscapes. The Irish House did not go gently into the good night, and in 1964 the Irish Examiner told their readers that if the Americans had such a specimen, they would jack up the house and roll it along to another site. Here we have no other use for a 94-year-old landmark of a pub when it gets in the way of site clearance than to knock it down. If such an idea of moving the pub sounds fanciful, any good Mancunian will tell you about Sinclair's Oyster Bar, which The Guardian, delighted in telling readers, has survived being raised 5 metres and being moved brick by brick 300 metres down the road. So it could have been done. Before getting into the Irish House in any detail, a worthy beginning for this presentation is surely Flora Mitchell's depiction of the pub. And the fear of Flora Mitchell, as she expressed it, was her sense that to walk in Dublin brings realization that soon it must become just another city of concrete and glass, colourless and stereotyped. She, one of the great chroniclers of the ever-changing city, captured so much in her book Vanishing Dublin, and more broadly in her work. And on closer inspection, when we look at this depiction of the Irish House, we see all kinds of interesting things on the gable wall of the neighbouring building, the three balls of the pawnbrokers. Sean O'Casey always maintained that the symbol of working class Dublin wasn't three burning castles, but the three balls of the pawnbrokers. So why discuss the Irish House in the context of a conference on Daniel O'Connell and the built environment? As Kevin B. Nolan rightly maintained, the facade of the Irish House was more than just a brilliant example of the work of the stucadores Burnett and Comerford. It was a powerful statement of belief in the claims of Ireland to legislative independence and for the restoration of an Irish Parliament meeting in College Green. And I would maintain that, in the increasingly nationalist city of the 19th century, the emerging townships beyond her canals led to a greener, by which I mean more nationalist, Dublin corporation. The pub's exterior was no less than a popular tribute to the aspirations of Grattan and Daniel O'Connell and their respective movements. I still recall seeing the figure of Daniel O'Connell from the Irish House, which was positioned on the Wine Tavern Street elevation of the pub, when it was displayed in the Dublin Civic Trust's former home on Castle Street in 2012. And I think for me, seeing this figure began my own fixation with the Irish House and with the lost pubs of Dublin. Look in his hand, he's holding that great unachieved aspiration, repeal of the Union. But the Irish House not only had a beautiful exterior, and we'll see more of it in a moment, it also had a fantastic interior. The Evening Herald lamented how the homely pot-bellied stove is unlikely to grace the centre of a modern carpeted lounge bar. The rich, dull shine of the brass taps and counterpumps will never be seen again unless it is in some pub museum. And where will the fine old clock set in its great oaken harp eventually end up? The depiction of Daniel O'Connell on the Irish House, funnily enough, wasn't unlike, in a curious little aside, the one that had once appeared at an advertisement for a later incarnation of what was called O'Connell Ale. Daniel O'Connell Jr. had famously acquired the Phoenix Brewery in James's Street in 1831, which produced O'Connell Ale. I think it must have been somewhat embarrassing for Daniel O'Connell that his son had invested so heavily in the brewing industry, given that O'Connell's movement in many ways was tied to that of the Temperance Crusade. And both Daniel O'Connell and Frederick Douglass, while Douglass was in Ireland, would take the pledge from Father Theobald Matthew. Not many people who'd taken the pledge found themselves advertising ale. John Darcy later continued to brew O'Connell Ale after the family had seized their role in brewing, and basically every Dublin brewer, except Guinness, at one point were involved in producing a beer called O'Connell Ale. The Anchor Brewery in Usher Street, as we see here, Watkins, eventually took up the brewing of O'Connell Ale. And funnily enough, this advertisement was placed by them in the 1930s in the pages of An Phoblacht. I don't know how Daniel O'Connell would have felt about that. So there's the Irish House in all its glory. And not merely the Irish House itself, but Wood Quay more broadly, has been completely transformed by the construction of the civic offices. So much of fundamental historical value was lost in those streets. But nonetheless, when Thomas F. Heffernan wrote his brilliant book, and his very important book, Wood Quay, The Clash Over Dublin's Viking Past, he still felt it was important to point out not just what we lost in terms of the fundamental beginnings of this city, but also what he called the modern jewels of the street, like the Irish House pub. Around the demolition site, he said, a hodgepodge of buildings of great variety of ages stood. And this image from the turn of the century shows two lost Dublin institutions of the Victorian age, the Irish House and the Dublin Metropolitan Police. The Irish House opened its doors in 1870 to a very considerably mixed response, it should be said. The Irish builder didn't like it, and they bemoaned how, in June, just weeks before it opened, the genius who designed the unsightly structure, now in the process of erection at the corner of Wine Tavern Street, has brought into view, by plentiful application of Portland cement, 6 ludicrous imitations of round towers perched upon its parapet. Ouch, and it got worse. We trust, for the honour of our profession, that the design will be ignored by the architects of Dublin, and that it will prove that this pub is the production of some juvenile anxious to try his practice hand, who has derived all his architectural knowledge from enlarging details upon a panel in a carpenter's workshop. But later on, I think people came to love the unusual appearance of the Irish House. The architect Raymond McGrath, in the pages of The Bell, would write about it in the 1940s and said, that he came to see it as a secular experiment in fancy, which is a great review for a building. The client, Patrick O'Kelly, well described in Peter Walsh's history of the building, was an elected poor law guardian for the Woodquay ward, and he's described by Walsh as a man of sufficient means to indulge his whim on Woodquay in 1870. I think that the pub opened its doors when it did is significant. 1870, the year witnessed the birth of Isaac Butt's Home Government Association, later destined to become the Home Rule League. It was also 50 years since the passing of Henry Grattan. Grattan had died in 1820, and Grattan never got the great Dublin funeral. He buried basically under the floorboards at the Westminster Abbey in London. But I think the 50th anniversary of Henry Grattan, it focused a lot of attention on him and his place in Irish history. It would still be 6 years before the appearance of the very impressive statue on College Green. But Grattan's anniversary had really moved him centre stage. And in the nation, it was said that perhaps of all the men who swayed the hearts of his countrymen by his eloquence and by the warm glow of his patriotism, kindled in Ireland a sense of national independence, there is not one who can dispute the claim for Henry Grattan. In that same year that the Irish House opened its doors, a monument to William Smith O'Brien was unveiled, and a speaker told the crowd that the forthcoming planned monuments — it took a long time to put a monument up in 19th century Dublin, especially when it was done by public subscription — but that the planned monuments to Grattan and O'Connell would serve as symptoms of the approaching triumph of the cause in which the lives of those great Irishmen were devoted. They were patriots in the highest and purest sense. They were for their country and not for faction. They were for religious liberty and equality. They were for the equal right of all citizens before the law. They were anxious to obtain national home government, if possible, without revolution or bloodshed. Closer detail of O'Connell as he appeared in the pub. And as we heard earlier on today, I really don't think you can separate the Irish House pub from what was happening in the years around it. So the removal of Daniel O'Connell's remains to a permanent tomb in Glasnevin Cemetery the previous year had really brought the liberator himself back into focus. And O'Connell's round tower and tomb — that's from the Irish builder who are selling a beautiful lithograph of the tomb to which the remains of Daniel O'Connell has been removed. But I think the fact that O'Connell had gone to permanent rest in that tomb just a year earlier is part of the story of the Irish House pub as well. And Emily Mark Fitzgerald rightly notes that the appropriation of early medieval Irish symbols for prominent funerals and commemorations reflected the triumph of that form and its association with Irish patriotism, sacrifice, and national identity. The Grattan anniversary, the O'Connell Tower, I think are key moments around the time the pub opened. But we might ask, what about 1867? Just 3 years before the Irish House pub opened. This is the final resting place of some protagonists from the 1867 Fenian Rising in Glasnevin, men who fought in the mountains of Dublin, the Battle of Tallaght, and all around it. And look at their grave. It includes many of the same visual trappings as the Irish House pub. But as Kevin B. Nolan rightly noted, when you look at the Irish House, there's no image of Wolfe Tone or even Robert Emmet. Everything that was on the pub came from the constitutional nationalist tradition, even though Ireland was just 3 years on from a violent attempted revolution. And I think perhaps, as we all learned in our recent decade of centenaries, I think there is a relationship between commercial interests and commemoration. It's hard to imagine if the Irish House pub had opened 28 years later, in 1898, I think definitely Wolfe Tone would have been there. In 1898, there was the great fanfare of that commemoration. Reflecting on the commercial dimensions of the 1798 centenary, Peter Collins has written that Leonard's chemist in Dublin sold 98 centenary perfume. Bushmills whiskey, with its distillery in a staunchly Protestant village in Antrim, proclaimed in advertisements that true patriots drink Bushmills. Posters, postcards, and novels in 1898 portrayed the faith and fatherland, heroic, priest-led version of 98. In other words, I think Grattan and O'Connell, they were the men of the commercial moment in 1870. And after the Fenian Rebellion, there had been real suppression against pubs in Dublin that were connected to the movement. The pub we know as the Long Hall was forced to close its doors by the authorities for several years. The Bleeding Horse pub was raided by the authorities as well. So I don't think any publican wanted to associate their premises with the violent traditions of Irish republicanism. One thing that's extraordinary about the pub is that often the name of a former publican remains on a premises long after they've moved on. A good example is across the street. The Castle Lounge was only owned by a man called Joe Grogan for about 5 years. The pub is still known as Grogan's. But there's something really serendipitous about the fact that the first owner of this pub and the last owner, who were not related to each other, were both called O'Mara's. So the pub is popularly known as O'Mara's Irish House, which was both the first and the last name upon it. But surviving images show it at different times. There it is as Timony's. There's a lot of focus on the appearance of O'Connell on Wine Tavern Street. We have the weeping figure of Erin there with her stringless harp. We have Henry Grattan addressing the Parliament on College Green. I think there's another nice detail in the building that's sometimes overlooked. So up top amidst the round towers and the cast iron, we see Céad Míle Fáilte. It was quite unusual to see the Irish language used like that more than 20 years before the establishment of Cunnar na Gaeilge when the pub first opened. The language, though, was very much not viewed as a political football in the 1870s, and while we saw the chain of the Lord Mayor of Dublin earlier on, complete with King William of Orange, nonetheless, the chain of Belfast's Lord Mayor, which was first worn in the 1870s, includes the words Éireann go bragh. So the Irish language was anything but a political football at that time. But it still was quite unusual to see the Irish language appearing quite prominently in the front of the business premises in Dublin. The pub was in an extraordinarily important location later on. It survived the revolutionary period intact. There was very fierce fighting in its immediate vicinity during both the Easter Rising and the Civil War. In many ways, the opening salvo of the Civil War, those shots were fired in the direction of the Four Courts building from that corner on Wine Tavern Street. But the pub came through it. I could only find one mention to the pub in the revolutionary press. The Irish Newspaper Archives website has expanded in recent times to include lots of revolutionary newspapers from the 1913 to 23 period. I only found the Irish House mentioned once, an article bemoaning the fact that more businesses in Dublin did not include patriotic signage or the language. There is nothing, the paper said, save moral slot to prevent the people of Dublin giving some semblance of nationalism to the life of this capital. The street names are sometimes in Irish, and they can be read with the aid of a microscope. But the names of businesses, establishments themselves should be boldly in Irish as well. As far as I can judge from a few recent visits to the city centre, there are less than 24 shops or pubs with the names of their owners or any mention of the native language. A very important question about the Irish House that was asked of me by a three-generation publican was it any good? Was it a good pub? By which I think he meant, was it a pub that had a regular clientele? Was it part of its community, or was it considered a little bit naff, in terms of its appearance? Brendan Behan, in his book Brendan Behan's Island, asked why it should be called the Irish House in Ireland. I don't know. But the pub exterior features frequently in guidebooks to the city, and the O'Mara's, the Evening Herald said, has become known to thousands who've never actually been in Ireland. It featured in Bord Fáilte tourist publications in America and in Europe. But when a journalist visited the pub in 1964, when rumours of its imminent demise were everywhere, They found a big clientele of locals who have quaffed their pints there for years. So whatever about the exterior attracting the visitor's gaze, it does seem to have been a pub that was in its community. We get a glimpse of the Irish house in Joseph Strick's ambitious 1967 big screen take on Ulysses. Strick made no attempt to hide 1960s Dublin from the cameras. I really like that. I mean, Joyce was ultimately a modernist. And when you watch the 1967 Ulysses, you can see, for example, Desmond Rio Kelly's 16-story Liberty Hall is in the background. Modern cars and miniskirts and all kinds of things. Strick originally intended to make his Ulysses 18 hours in length. Imagine. Though financial constraints thankfully prevented this. And instead of the citizen chasing Leopold Bloom from Barney Kernan's, the scene was filmed at the Irish House. So we get a look inside. It's really well done. Milo brilliantly plays the role of Leopold Bloom. When its time had come, and the hoardings went around the Irish House, plaster casts of the building's stucco panels were made in situ. O'Connell, Grattan, Aaron weeping. Other things that they could take entirely, like the entrance doors, they salvaged as well. And the decision to save as much of the Irish House as possible was made by Lord Boyne, Vice Chairman of Guinness. He financed the project. But I think maybe something is owed to Joseph Strick. Maybe the 1967 movie adaptation of Ulysses had played a role in the decision to save features from this pub, because the link between the pub and Joyce, even though Joyce, as far as I can tell, had never actually been there, it's far more likely his father was there at one point, but I've no evidence Joyce was ever there. The connection between the pub and Ulysses had been made. Guinness would include the artefacts in an exhibition in the brewery celebrating the writer. Their press release said that the figures came from a Joycean pub, which once stood on Wood Quay. Now, whatever about the Irish House, Guinness was certainly Joycean. As we read in Ulysses, Lord Ivy once cashed a 7-figure cheque for $1 million in the Bank of Ireland. Shows you the money to be made out of porter. The death of the Irish House led to much reflection in the press. The old-fashioned Dublin pub, the Independent told readers, had good drinks, but small comfort and small aesthetic appeal. But the Irish House was something else. There was much reflection, too, on the broader loss of so much of the architectural fabric of Wine Tavern Street. In 1964, the Herald said, "These houses were built in the 17th century. Some of them were possibly the original taverns," and not this, but the houses just out of the street, "which gave this street its name. Future generations of Dubliners will only know what this street looked like from Harry Kernoff's paintings of Wine Tavern Street in the Municipal Art Gallery." Those wishing to enjoy a pint in a pub celebrating constitutional nationalist heroes these days, you'll have to go down the road to Kilkenny, where the Home Rule Club can still be found. Initially established in 1894, on its walls you'll find former Parliamentary Party MPs, including John Redmond, the leader who came closest to the dream of the men who were on top of the Irish House. Interestingly, no Charles Stewart Parnell, which tells you how Kilkenny fell in the split. And on Belfast's Falls Road, the Ancient Order of Hibernian Social Club honours the local politician Wee Joe Devlin, once the assistant manager of the famed Belfast boozer Kelly Sellers. His main claim to fame was surviving the Sinn Féin wave in the 1918 general election, returned as one of Ireland's few surviving Home Rule MPs. But I think that social club on the Falls Road and the Home Rule Club in Kilkenny, they're really unusual, because normally speaking, pubs would be named in honour of those like Theobald Wolfe Tone, those who came more from the Republican tradition than the constitutional nationalist one. If there's ever going to be a museum of Dublin public houses, perhaps the figures from the Irish House would find a home there, a menu from Bartley Dunn's, the gentlemen-only signs that once dotted bars before the thirsty activism of Nell McCafferty, levelled the playing field. The final copy of the Evening Press, signed by that other great Kerry man, Con Houlihan, and displayed in Mulligan's, is a relic of a different kind too. But more than anything, such a museum, I think, will be driven by the stories of the men and women who plied their trade in the industry in pubs like the Irish House. And as I said at the beginning, while the Irish House is lost, we can still save Barney Kiernan's. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Donal. Always so very important to bring this important part of the city's, lost part of the city's heritage to our attention once again. And for the potential of those artifacts that survive the need to find a suitable home for them. We're late in the day at this point in time, but before we wrap up for this evening, I want to just go over again those who have provided essential support for us. So initially I want to thank our partners in Dublin City Council, its Heritage Officer Charles Duggan and his colleague Abigail O'Reilly. I note that Abigail designed the brochure, the booklet that has accompanied today's proceedings. I also wish to thank the Department of Culture, Communications and Sport, the National Built Heritage Services Division of the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, the Heritage Council and Ecclesiastical Insurance. Finally, I wish to thank Emmeline Henderson, who organised the day and did such an extraordinary job in doing so. And thanks must also be given to Yulia, to Megan, to Claire, to Jasmine and to Georgia, who've been beavering away behind the scenes, making sure everything has run smoothly. Thank you so much, everybody, and safe home.